I play a lot of JRPGs, and I've spent some time on forums devoted to the subgenre. On all of these forums, there's always a question that comes up every couple of weeks. Is Dark Souls a JRPG? Being a bit of a taxonomy nerd, I've put an unreasonable amount of thought into that question, and my short answer is no, I don't think Soulsborne games are generally JRPGs. But they are really neat games that I'm not very good at, so please enjoy watching me struggle through some Souls-like games while I explain my reasoning. To start with, I want to define the purpose of genre just to frame the conversation. Genre is a classification system that we use to organize media based on some sort of stylistic criteria. A couple important things to note is that as media evolves, so does genre. A first-person shooting game today, for example, would play very differently and is likely to include different stylistic elements than a first-person shooting game made in the 90s. But we don't need a separate genre for old and new shooting games, we just expand our scope of what a shooter is to contain both. When a game pushes the boundaries of a genre really far, though, it may create its own genre or subgenre. In recent years, we can see this with things like Metroidvanias kind of becoming their own thing. If this all sounds somewhat arbitrary, that's because it really is. Genre isn't defined by a checklist of features that all games within a genre have to have. Instead, it covers a variety of stylistic choices that a work might make, and we have to decide which genre is the best fit. In some ways, it's more art than science. This also means that my definition of a JRPG, and thus my genre classification of Dark Souls, may not be the same as yours, and neither of us are necessarily wrong or right. But an example of why this approach can still be helpful is something like the movie Avengers Endgame. This movie includes many aspects of the comedy genre, but most people would call it an action movie or maybe a superhero movie if they see that as its own genre rather than a subgenre of action movies. So the point of genre, as with many media classification systems, is to help us compare media and have a mutual understanding of each other when we discuss creative works. It's useful for me to understand what a MOBA is and how it differs from a traditional RTS so that when my friend asks me to recommend a MOBA for him to play, I can tell him League of Legends instead of StarCraft 2. Thinking critically about what a genre means and what is contained in that genre is also a good way to become more literate regarding that genre. So with all that in mind, to someone that's only passingly familiar with Dark Souls and JRPGs, you might wonder why Dark Souls would even be considered a JRPG. When most people think about JRPGs, they usually think of turn-based games like older Final Fantasy games, or maybe an action RPG like one of the more recent Final Fantasy games, or a game in the Tales series. Dark Souls is such a departure from these games both aesthetically and in terms of gameplay that they may not seem immediately comparable. But if we break down the JRPG acronym, we can see where the contention lies. JRPG stands for Japanese role-playing game. Dark Souls has many of the trappings of role-playing games, including stats, equipment, leveling up, and more, and it's also made by a Japanese company, so logically that would make it a Japanese role-playing game, right? Well, I would argue that this isn't a useful definition of JRPG. Defining a JRPG as any RPG made in Japan makes sense at a surface level as it's really easy to categorize games this way. We have a clear-cut definition, and it's obvious what falls in it and what doesn't. The problem is that categorizing games in this way doesn't actually tell us much about the games in the subgenre we're talking about. It also results in some unexpected outcomes, like Final Fantasy IX not counting as a JRPG because it was developed in Hawaii and not in Japan. Similarly, games like Cosmic Star Heroine that are clearly inspired by classic JRPGs and their mechanics wouldn't be considered Japanese RPGs because they weren't developed in Japan. So limiting JRPGs to only RPGs developed in Japan not only doesn't tell us anything about the games within the genre, it also tells us very little about the games that we don't consider in that genre. A simple example of why classifying things by region instead of style isn't terribly useful is food. You don't have to go to Italy to get Italian food, and if you got sushi in Italy, you wouldn't say that you just ate Italian food. Instead, we define food by its ingredients and how it's prepared. Even though this is a more vague categorization system, defining food in this way helps decide what restaurants we should go to and what food we should order. This is the way I think we should look at games too, in order to make genre as useful a tool as possible, both for discussion and for helping us find new games to play. So we know what genre is, but we still have to define what stylistic criteria denote a game in the JRPG genre. I'm just going to name some of the key criteria that seem most obvious to me. Of course, we could list hundreds of tropes, trends, and mechanics, and I recommend checking out the TV tropes page for JRPGs if you want to do that. but given limited time, I want to focus on some of the most common and more standout features of JRPGs. Not every JRPG will meet all of these criteria, and many games in different genres will meet some of these criteria. The goal is simply to create a list of traits that most JRPGs possess many of. So here's the 3 standout trends from JRPGs that I've come up with, and this is for JRPGs specifically, so that means no leveling up or stats, which I think are already covered by the RPG parent genre. So first we have menu-based combat, which I would say covers both turn-based systems and most common action-based RPG systems like the Final Fantasy VII Remake, where you still manage inventory and ATB systems through a menu. JRPGs also tend to feature linear storytelling, whereas Western RPGs often offer player choice in the form of character creation and multiple-choice dialogue systems with some tangible effect on the narrative. JRPGs usually opt for more linear stories and are less likely to have highly customizable characters, especially in terms of personality, and may only offer a few or no narrative choices. The trade-off being a more curated narrative experience compared to most Western RPGs. Lastly, Japanese RPGs tend to include a party system. There are some solo RPGs, especially if we look back towards earlier phases of the genre with things like the original Dragon Quest game, but for the most part, in JRPGs, you tend to get to run with 2 or 3 active allies that you have some amount of control over for the bulk of the game. Of course, there are many other traits that could potentially be associated with the JRPG genre, but these 3 are really common and I think some of the most unique and stand out to the genre. So let's take a look at Dark Souls. To start with, I think Dark Souls is definitely an RPG. The genre is really broad, and Dark Souls ticks the major boxes, including stats, leveling up, equipment, and players taking the role of a character through a story. When it comes to JRPGs, though, I think Dark Souls isn't a clear fit. One of the defining features of Dark Souls is its combat system. The combat system is heavily tilted towards the action end of the spectrum, and while there are some menu-based components, namely the management of your inventory slots, the main focus is the action. Additionally, while Dark Souls has stats and levels, the biggest contributing factor to your success is player skill. In most JRPGs, player skill is used in tandem with stats, level, and equipment to determine your success in the game. In many JRPGs, even if you play perfectly, there are some bosses that require you to meet certain minimum stat benchmarks no matter how skilled you are. Skilled play can help you finish JRPGs at a lower level than other players, but in most of them you have to progress your character in some way to finish the game. In Dark Souls, players can beat the game with minimal character progression provided they have the skill, and it's difficult, if not impossible in some cases, to grind so much that skill is not the most important factor to your success. Skill has such a high influence on Dark Souls that many players of the game that have beat it before start challenge runs where they do things like not leveling up at all or not upgrading their equipment. So Dark Souls does have some gameplay similarities to Japanese action RPGs, but I would argue that its gameplay offers a different experience that's unique enough that it doesn't really fit in or compare directly to those games. In terms of storytelling, Dark Souls matches up with JRPGs in that the story is told with relatively few points for player narrative choice, but the way that Dark Souls tells its story is largely through its atmosphere, with lore being delivered through item descriptions, short dialogue sections, and environmental cues, with some details left open to interpretation from the player. This is unlike many JRPGs, which tend to be more direct, telling stories through cutscenes and a lot of text boxes, often including a little more direct exposition. Dark Souls also provides character creation, though it doesn't have a major impact on the narrative. You won't see many JRPGs with Dark Souls style of storytelling. Many include environmental storytelling or provide lore in the form of item descriptions, but it's rarely the main form in which lore is delivered like it is in Dark Souls. This is somewhat reminiscent of the environmental storytelling in Bethesda RPGs or some Metroidvania games, which utilize the environments of dungeons as well as books and terminals to build the world, although many of these do have a main story that's delivered primarily through text or dialogue. So I would say that Dark Souls' method of storytelling is largely different than what one would expect to find in JRPGs, though there are some minor similarities. Dark Souls is also largely a single-character game with no real implementation of a party system. The closest thing Dark Souls has to a party system is phantoms, which are temporary allies that last until the end of a stage and have no characterization. You don't directly control them, and they disappear at the end of every level, which makes them pretty different from the traditional JRPG party system of characters that you have usually some amount of direct control over, and often have characters that develop throughout the game. So now that we've gone through some of the most common JRPG trends and how Dark Souls compares to them, let's take a look at Soulsborne games holistically and come to a conclusion. The biggest area where Dark Souls differs from typical JRPGs is in its lack of a party system and its highly skill-focused gameplay. Party systems are so endemic to the JRPG genre that it's present in all of its subgenres, and it's very rare to see a JRPG depart from a party system. Even Japanese action RPGs tend to have some form of party system included. The storytelling of Dark Souls, as well as its fantasy motif, is one of the areas where it is somewhat close to a JRPG, but even then, I would say that the way the narrative is delivered is a pretty big departure from what one would expect from JRPGs. And if we consider the whole package, I would say that Dark Souls in general is a pretty big departure from what people expect from a JRPG. I think if you were trying to recommend your friend a similar game to Dark Souls, most JRPGs would be a poor choice, and if you wanted to recommend a JRPG fan another JRPG to play, I think Dark Souls probably isn't the right pick. And this really gets to the core of what genre is good for, helping us find games with conventions that we like, and helping us avoid games with conventions that we don't like. While Dark Souls includes some aspects of JRPGs, it's different enough from other games in the genre that it's hard to categorize them together as being media with similar styles and design choices. That being said, I don't think it's enough to just call Dark Souls a Western RPG or an action RPG either. I think Souls games are unique enough and have inspired such a variety of imitators that they should be considered their own subgenre, Souls-like games, which could be thought of as a subgenre of action RPGs. Interestingly, Code Vein is a Souls-like game that takes the Souls formula in terms of combat and progression, but adds aesthetics and storytelling that are more in line with what one expects from a JRPG, as well as includes a limited party system in which you can have an AI character follow you into battle, though you have no direct control over them. This begs the question, is the Souls-style gameplay enough to make Code Vein not fit into the JRPG genre, or does it fit? Personally, I would say that it counts as a JRPG, but it's very borderline. So if you're a Dark Souls fan that wants to get into JRPGs, or a JRPG fan that wants to get into Souls-like games, Code Vein might be the perfect bridge. Do you have a different opinion on what genre Dark Souls belongs in, or other ideas on what design choices make up a JRPG? Let me know in the comments, and like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. I also stream every Saturday at 10:30 AM CST, so come hang out if you're interested at twitch.tv/badgerbarian, and have yourself an awesome week.